Welcome back. This is the Pawn Sacrifice channel, and probably the point when you're wondering whether you're ever going to hear from me again and just one of these channels have disappeared. Essentially what I've been doing is rewiring the car, and believe it or not, I haven't been having loads of time off. When it got really cold I was doing some shorter days, but it's just taken me a very long time to get through this, mostly because I don't know what I'm doing, or mostly because I'd start something, spend a weekend trying to make a bracket to mount relays or fuses or something like that, going through a few iterations, realising I went wrong and doing something completely different. So that's kind of why this has taken so long. Yeah, but essentially just taking the VW Audi loom, which had loads of extra wiring on it, so this mess on the floor is everything that's come out of this. To give you an idea, this was the loom stripped down, laid out on the bench here, where I was going through testing, just working out what everything was, and what I've done is replaced it all with this. So as you saw, I basically stripped everything down. If you're new to this, I just could have done this a lot quicker if I had confidence in myself and what I was doing, but because I was being very methodical each stage, labelling everything, it took a long time. But yeah, essentially starting at the ECU end, we've got the connectors coming out here. I've been through, identified everything of what's what and where I wanted it to go, and essentially everything's got looming tape on it to protect it because I've taken all that off, and then put this braided material on and then heat shrink over that. This one's slightly different because essentially to get this on I had to de-pin everything, feed it through, and then it just took forever. So when it came to this one, I did it, but then there was a problem with one of the connectors. I had to redo it, so I just wrapped it instead. It'll be fine. This is internal, so this is going inside the car with the original mounting point. Deutsch connector there, this is just stuff that's running internally, so I've tried to break up the wires as much as possible, so anything that plugs in on the engine that's easy to get to and remove, I've just left that where it is. Other stuff, if it's more difficult or off somewhere or going internally, then I've put a connector in there, just basically to split that out as much as possible. So that's that. For the firewall, essentially all of this side, all of this here, so that I could fit it underneath or through this, the grommet here. So that was all just wires and connectors at one point waiting to be put back together, but essentially this is all loomed up underneath, and all I've done is worked out where it's going to pass through the firewall, and just basically to get the best seal on to protect the grommet as well, is just put some heat shrink over the top of that, so I recommend doing that. I've split the loom at the thing into a couple of different points, so there's one internally, one external, or a couple of external ones as well. And yeah, that's pretty much it. The way that I've gone about this is some of the cables have cut down and been spliced together, and all I've done is just used, this was a Skid Factory reference, so just got a little pin, not little connectors like that, just cut the end off and then just basically crimped that over the wires, put heat shrink over the top, and then loomed everything up, and that seems to work nicely. For some of them, like for instance the fuel injectors, essentially this is pretty much snug where they need to be. For the original wiring, they would have been out here somewhere with a load of extra stuff to hide and get rid of, which didn't really work. So with these ones, what I did was cut them down, and I actually bought some of the spare pins, just got those off of eBay. So the other thing I guess I would call out here is the connectors, and what you need to look for there. I originally had some Deutsch connectors, and I've got loads of these things now, but I ended up going with these Delphi ones because although there's far too many pins in them, the 4 on the outside actually take far more amps. I think it's about 30 or 40 amps, and for the fan certainly there's going to be quite a few amps going through there. So do check when you're putting connectors on. Don't just buy something and then throw it in, even if it's a nice one to use like the Delphi. They're so much easier to plug than this other stuff. but with those, just make sure that you've got the right amps for everything. So that's basically is the loom. What I'll do is I'll add some info on all of the pins and stuff. What you do need to do is just make your notes, and that is a bit of a mess, but essentially what I'll do is I'll add this at the end, was just go through and work out what everything was doing on the Porsche side of things. So to do this, there's a 9-pin connector which came to the file, which had most of the stuff I needed to rob or connect to. So for instance, the some of the power things, the sensors going back through the wall, and yeah, so there's a whole load of things on there. I was fairly methodical with this, so what I did was just use this little light bulb and essentially attach this. So say for instance it was the power for the fuel injectors, which comes off of the DME relay. So you connect one side to the pin that you think it is, the other side to the ground, just turn it on, the light comes on to show you that it's working and that the contact's there and what it needs to be, and then just ping out the fuse and the relay if you want, or the relay if you just want to double check it and make sure it's right. For the Porsche wiring, the wiring diagrams from that side are on Pelican parts. There's a whole bunch of them scattered around, but this is stuff that's been scanned in, so if you look for just do a search for Pelican parts 944 wiring. It's a really good site. The forum there is really solid, and I've found the information to be really reliable. And if you're in the States, I kind of wish it was over here, because it seems to be a good place to buy stuff from. And next up, most importantly, the tools, right tools for the job. This was a really great investment. It was only about £45 for the wire stripper and connector kit. You can spend hundreds on these things, which is what proper auto electricians get. So the wire strippers are a bit temperamental, but I can live with that for the price. And then these crimping tools just work really well, really neat, quick, easy to get things done. And I've got a hydraulic one for doing the big things, which is just basic hydraulic press with a die in it that crimps around that. All the usual sort of screwdrivers, different pliers, snippers, all of that sort of thing. The pinning tools, multimeter. This has been, again, quite invaluable in terms of just checking my workings. If you haven't got one yet, or even if you have, it's really useful to have one with a continuity tester on it. So when you connect two things up, it just beeps. So if I'm wondering whether there's a break in the circuit or something's not working, put that on one end, touch them together, and it beeps. The only thing I would say with that, and this is to learn from my mistakes, is that is actually pretty beefy on the connector. I mean, it's not massively, but it's not a small connector. So what I ended up doing after finding I was breaking pins, chucking that in, was just to get a pin, attach it to a crocodile clip, feed that in, attach the other crocodile clip to the cable on here, and then everything just worked dandy. So that was really useful as well. I've got the Haynes manual largely for this, but I have used it for other stuff and torque settings and what have you, but just make sure you get the right model of year, and it will have the wiring diagram in there. It's a little hit and miss at times, so some of the stuff isn't quite right, or it's got stuff on here or not on here, which is in the loom. It's just going to be down different versions of the engine through the years, which is a bit of a pain, but it is what it is. Removing stuff. So there are things which you will delete from the system because you don't need them. This was some evap valve, which I think essentially the system's now been replaced where I've put the catch can in. This was the wire that was going up to the connector that it then plugs into, and essentially all I've done is just attach a resistor in line, so attach it to one wire and then attach it to the other. It's not directional apparently, so I was just able to do that, then loomed it, heat shrunk it, and it's all nicely protected, and that's going to sit inside the car. The only reason for doing this is the car just works fine without it, but it does give an error code if you don't do this, and trick it into thinking that that's still there in a particular state. Next we have these little rascals, my little relays. I've added 3 in, core packs, fan and sensor power. All of these are just basically hung up on a strip. So I've taken these, which are essentially the fuse blocks from a spare fuse board that I had from the original Porsche system, and I've just suspended those and then just pinned them. When you get the spade connectors, just make sure there's a little barb on the back, because otherwise there's nothing to stop them coming straight back out when you plug the relay in. So yeah, essentially what I've got is the core pack and the sensor. They're just off of a switch live, which comes on when you turn the key on. Then the fan itself is triggered by the electric water pump, so there's a switched earth signal which goes into the relay, which tells that to start or stop. So the other video, if you want to know more details about that, kind of explains all of that. The other one in there is the injectors. The injectors essentially run off of the DME relay. So when you turn the key on, that essentially sends the power. It's the switch live, which does the same thing as everything else. But what then happens is there's a second signal which comes from a switched earth. This is one of the wires in here. Essentially, this is a signal from the ECU, which then comes out and says, right, okay, fuel pump, we're ready, disco. Start sending some fuel down. So essentially that turns that on just by switching the earth, and then we're ready to go. So that's all been relatively straightforward, other than finding a place to actually put them, which has been a bit of a nightmare. The other thing which I've added in there are some fuses as well. So the standard ones for this are bullet connectors. There weren't any spare slots or anything that I could use, so I've just gone out and got, I can't be bothered to find it now, but I've got about 3 or 4 different fuse boards. I just ended up using a small strip one because I couldn't find a place to locate the others. A while ago I relocated the battery to the back of the car, so I built a box to put that in the rear footwell, and then I've just basically run I think it's gauge 0 cable down from the back to the essentially the passenger's footwell, where all the other electrics and stuff is going on. And the way that I've done this is there's now a mega fuse which is right next to the battery, which was something I was told to do in the comments. Essentially what I've done with this is got this big dirty cable, and I've just put the protective sheathing over it, which just hopefully helps prevent nicks. It's not really going to do very much. It also just makes it look a bit neater. What I've then done is just attached it in place with P-clips. So I've put these along, so I've just riv nutted into the side, and then just put these along, and essentially I've just laid it out so that it avoids any snagging points, and also where it's coming over one section I've just kind of bent it round so that it's not going to push against sharp edge. The only other thing I've done is where I've got the sections with the P-clip, even though it's got the sheathing over the top, is I've just put some heat shrink on there as well, just to help protect those two from rubbing against each other too much. Just tidied those up and then essentially carried that on down to the footwell. In the footwell, essentially what I've got is this terminal block, and essentially it's two bolts which are connected together, and I've just gone in on one side, which essentially this kind of setup that goes on one side. You've got a metal plate, and then on the other side is the one that goes out to the starter motor. What I was originally going to look at, or what I did, again, spent a lot of time invested in, what I ended up doing was running it off the junction post and then just passing it through the firewall, the cable itself, into a grommet, and again sheathing and then heat shrink just on the place where it needed to be protected. So the factory Porsche positive wires which were going to the battery, I've essentially cut those back, crimped on terminals and connected them there, and a couple of other bits for internally as well that needed power. I've just basically wired them up to that point. I've also added a ground point to the to where it was originally in the factory, and essentially just run that down There's some which is going to bits on the loom, and then there's another section which essentially is a bigger cable which goes down to the bell housing, which is the location, and that you want to try and get that as close to the starter as possible. Internal cabling. Essentially this has been done so that I'm not having to remove extra bits, and each section, and this is partly what took time for me, is planning out going from one side of the car to the other, how I can connect or remove certain things at different points. So from here I've got 6 connectors coming off. There's 3 of which are power, so I've got the permanent 12 volt, the switch 12 volt, and then the power for the sensors, which I think just disappears off up the loom. And then in addition to that there's the K-line signal, and essentially what this is the signal to the ODB2 port, which is mounted, or is going to be mounted in or around the glove box. It's just useful for troubleshooting, as long as you know what you've got problems with or what's going to cause errors if you've taken anything out which you're not going to use. I've also then got the switched ground supply, which goes to the DME relay to tell, so the ECU can tell the fuel pump when to work. And then the final one is the tacho signal, which just goes up to the instrument cluster, so essentially the rev counter. That's not the right signal, but I've hopefully got a fix for that, which will sort that out. The coil conversion that I've done, this will be a separate video because it's worth covering, and worth covering properly for the people that are going to want to do it themselves, rather than padding out this video massively and unnecessarily. But essentially what I've done is the original AEB coils, which are a bit flaky because they use this, I think it's called an ICM. What I've done is bought a kit and upgraded to the R8 coils, which is an option, and they just plug in again in a Deutsch connector to the loom. That went reasonably well. There was a few problems, quite bizarre problem in terms of the wiring error, but I'll cover all of that separately. So yeah, I mean that's pretty much it. That's the actual final thing that I needed to mention, the sensors. So this is for oil, so I've got pressure for 2, and then a single one for temperature. And there's 2 differences here between the VW Audi setup and the Porsche. The original one is that on the original Porsche setup, essentially it has 2 functions on the pressure. One is for the dial or the gauge, and then the other one is for the warning light, whereas this one only has the pressure gauge, I think. So essentially what I've done is added a second wire on, bought a new sensor which fitted in, so it's just an M10 by 1, I think it was, sensor, so just chucked that in there. What that's going to do is now give me the original connectors, so that will just be wired through on part of that original loom. And then we've got the temperature, which didn't actually exist on the 924S. So what I've done is gone out and got a VDO gauge, which is going to be in keeping with the ones which were originally in there, and also in keeping with the turbo boost gauge that I bought as well. So I just need to find a place to mount those. What I'll do is just finish up by chucking the loom back in and just give you an idea of what it all looks like on the car. Well, hopefully that wasn't too dull for people that aren't doing this themselves, and it'll give you a kind of sense of what's involved in doing the wiring. I would just say everything, as always does, just takes so much longer. Even just, you know, making up the length of wire to run from that side over to here. It's a small number of wires. By the time you've thought about, okay, it needs to disconnect here, it needs to disconnect here, so that you can easily remove it without taking the whole loom out. and that's taking out, you know, 1 or 2 hours up for doing each little bit, so it really does take a lot longer than you're expecting. The only other thing which I did just after this was just mounting the ECU in the original place. All I did was get a sheet of steel, drill some holes in it. Unfortunately it's kind of upside down, so I've just got some 3M sticky pads to put those on. It's nice and light, it should be absolutely fine. The nice thing is it just fits in the original location. But yeah, just research. You know, if you're not sure, make things slightly too long, because although it's not tidy, you can always hide stuff around. Pleased with the way everything's turned out, and yeah, like I say, hopefully this is of enough interest to people that aren't doing this themselves. For those of you that are doing this themselves, in a second, I'm just, as I mentioned, just going to put up details around the wiring on a couple bits, and then I'm going to be following up fairly shortly with the coil pack conversion for this. Definitely worth doing if you're doing a 1.8T conversion, no matter what it's going into. Just get that done as you're doing it. There's a bit of a problem, but I'll explain that there. So yeah, thanks as always for watching. Apologies for the delay. I know it's frustrating when you're watching builds and they're not going anywhere. So yeah, I'll carry on with a few different bits, but hopefully have something else to share fairly soon. Cheers.